Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of Youth in Landscape Initiative and the Global Landscape Forum, we are so happy to have you here from all over the world joining us. My name is Betty Osei-Bonsu. I serve as a project coordinator for Green Africa Youth Organization from Ghana. I am here today to hold a space for this special Youth Daily Show for Global Landscape Africa. The Youth Daily Show shows are short 30-minute sessions designed to share youth expertise and to inspire people all over the world with amazing leaders driving change. Before starting off though, we would want to hear from you all over the world. We would like to hear from those of you participating today on the event platform, WOVA. To participate in our sessions poll, what you have to do is select the poll tab on this session page where you are streaming right now within WOVA, located next to the chat and question and answers tab. Next, the question we would like to invite you to answer at this time is, what is a necessary element to build a radically inclusive and efficient restoration movement? Tell us in just one word. If you are tuning in from social media, we would still love to hear from you. Feel free to answer our question. What is a necessary element to build a radically inclusive and efficient restoration movement? Don't forget, in just a comment. Today, I will be discussing with Adjany Costa, an ethno-conservationist and the advisor for environmental affairs to the President of the Republic of Angola. It's such an honor. Welcome, Adjany. We are so happy to have you joining us today for this session.
Thank you.
Together, welcome. Together with Adjany, we'll be exploring the importance of setting robust foundations for a restoration movement that includes traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge. So Adjany, you have a very inspiring story. Could you talk to us about your background and what you developed, your passion for the wilderness, or should I say, and how you developed your passion for the wilderness and conservation?
Thank you very much, Betty. Such a pleasure to be here. My background is a little bit difficult to go through at all. In a nutshell, I am doing my PhD with ethno-conservation, working with local communities to try to improve current wetland management plans and include their cultural and traditional views on conservation. Through time, my passion for the wilderness has been motivated by several expeditions that I've done, and I've had the pleasure and possibility to interact with the wilderness directly, which has made me see the importance that it has beyond the economic views that the world has of wilderness.
Great, lovely response. It's great to hear how such passions are evolving and how we youth of today are looking up to people like you for a career path. So on this, you have pivoted quite a lot in your career from an ethnologist, I can't really pronounce the word, it's such a huge name, to Angola's youngest minister. And more recently, you have described yourself as an ethno-conservationist. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
So basically, ethno-conservation means that you are creating conservation plans that are cored in people, in local people, that you are trying to be as inclusive as possible towards their cultural views, their aspirations, their traditional knowledge, especially the traditional knowledge. So you're looking at conservation for the sake of biodiversity, but also for the improvement of local communities, having the local communities as the principal actors of such change.
Great, awesome. I love the mention of inclusivity and of their cultural view and traditional knowledge. Thank you very much, Adjany, for sharing your thoughts with us. Now, before moving on, let's quickly check the replies to our poll questions on WOVA. And the question, what is a necessary element to build a radically inclusive and efficient restoration movement? Oh, wow. I love the responses coming in. Collaborations, fundings, and many more. It's great to hear all these thoughts. I quite recall when seeing this question alone, it just brought some responses to me, and those quick responses were transparency and togetherness. Community and togetherness, transparency and togetherness. Looking at the response from the WOVA, it says a lot that we as a generation, we all have our thoughts inclined at some point. When I'm saying my response as transparency and togetherness, when there is a movement, you're talking about people. And when there is people, transparency is birthed from inclusion. And when there is inclusion, communities are able to put in bottom-up approach to policy decisions and activities that they engage in. And with that, this instigates community ownerships and even sustainability. And lastly, the word is togetherness, where when a community have a key goal to achieve, I tell you, whichsoever movement, the vision is always a realization. It's very, very important that we all have a radically inclusive and efficient restoration movement. So now to continue the session, as we have seen in those answers, restoration cannot happen without the community living in the landscape in which it is taking place. You, Adjany, you have worked in a lot of community-led projects, most notably the one in the Okavango Basin. I'd like to ask, are there any key elements in this project that contributed to its success? And could those be applied elsewhere? Over to you.
I think one of the main key elements that we figured out through time, because you figured out through time, is that it is very important that you are able to listen and that you are able to learn. We all have an idea and an ideal of what conservation should look like, of how we would like landscapes to look like, that sometimes are far-fetched from what the communities see their own landscapes and are used to seeing their landscapes. So I think a key element that started shifting the project to the right direction was exactly that: learning, listening, and being able to have empathy towards definitions and concepts that sometimes you are not as comfortable, but you still have to understand to be able to include it in the plan. So I think listening and learning are two very important key elements that are lacking from some projects, but are very important for its success.
Well said, Adjany. It's great to hear, because we as youth of today, these are some of the learning steps we should inculcate in our day-to-day activities. 3 key elements: listen, learn, and have empathy. Awesome. So now, in the context of the UN Decade on Environment, or should I say ecosystem restoration, what are some concrete steps you believe policymakers must take in order to make sure that restoration becomes a global movement with local and community ownership?
I think dialogue is a very important step. I think sometimes we get caught into the politics behind the policy making, but I think dialogue within the different structures and within the different contexts is very important to try to understand at what stage are others in and what stage are we in, and how can we get to a mid ground, because there isn't a one size fits all solution. And so we have to be able to dialogue to understand what is the best solution for each single one of us that will ultimately bring in a global movement, because what is being done in Europe or in the US might not apply, for example, to Africa, because the cultural and the economic dynamics are very different. So I think dialogue is very important.
Awesome. One, dialogue, and secondly, you mentioned this particular sentence that actually shifted my attention to Africa, where you said politics behind policy making. It's quite a sentence because we faced with a lot of challenges where politics are kind of driving our policy making and even our environmental decision making. And this is quite some of the issues we have in the system. Thank you very much for that inspiring answer. Well, so this Saturday on World Environment Day, we will see the official launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Following that, more and more actors will hopefully start to contribute to restoration efforts. In this very timely moment for the restoration movement, I would like to ask you, Adjany, what are some key lessons learned from conservation that we could apply to restoration?
I think one of the main lessons that is a very difficult lesson to learn is that there is no such thing as ideal conservation and restoration. I think there needs to be a line where we define where do we act and where do we let nature restore itself, because nature is dynamic. The way that a forest looked 20, 30, 100 years ago might not be the same that it will look in 30, 40, 100 years from now, just because of the dynamics of nature. So one of the key lessons is that there is no such thing as ideal for us in our very short timeline of being human. And so we have to look at restoration as wanting to achieve the best possible result, but aware that everything is dynamic. And sometimes the best possible result is not what we had foreseen, but what nature wants it to be, basically. So we have to be a little bit more loose in the concept of ideal conservation and thus restoration.
Quite impressive. There is nothing like ideal conservation. This ideal conservation, there's nothing like ideal conservation. Wow, this really influences policy. And with another sentence you made, you said where we should allow nature to repair itself. This is something we should really take into consideration because sometimes we try to put in our own efforts. Really, we should let nature repair itself. Speaking of policy and youth, based on your experience as the youngest ever Minister for Culture, I would want to walk in your shoes, Adjany. Tourism and environment in the history of Angola and in your current advisory role. So what are the elements that make a policy successful for biodiversity conservation and landscape restoration?
There is one element that it sounds very simple, but it's actually very tricky, which is making it applicable. A policy to be successful, it has to be applicable. And that is sometimes the element that is missing from a lot of policy making and the policy makers, because not most, but some don't have a perspective on the ground and thus won't realize the little nuances of that policy and how it affects the local implementation. So a policy to be successful, it has to be applicable. It sounds very simple. It really isn't.
Yes, well said, well said. Wow. For policy to be effective, it has to be applicable. Yes, it really has to be applicable. We should not be developing policies that are out of the capacity of the community or whoever it is being implemented for. This is something the government should take note of when we are actually implementing policy. And not to forget that policies are not implemented for the current age, they are implemented for the future generations, and which are the youth. Talking about youth, with a median age of 19.7 years, Africa's diverse population is much younger than that of any other continent in the world. Yes. What is, in your opinion, the role of youth in restoring Africa's drylands? How can organizations, other generations, including those that are currently in positions of power and influence, contribute to this effort? Adjany, please.
So I'm going to shift And I'm going to answer the last one first.
Okay.
I think what can other generations, is just understanding the roles that we have. Sometimes older generation look at us as naive people that hasn't seen the world and thus doesn't understand its dynamics. We do have a very important role, and we do move the pieces of the puzzle quite dynamically. And I think that is a role that is necessary. So it's not a competition. It is that each and every single one of us has a role in society. And our role is to keep the machine going. I think through time, as someone ages, as you get experience with life, whatever it is, family or work or studies, you start losing energy and you start losing hope and you stop believing. And so I think the role of the younger generations is to remind the other generations that it's still possible to believe, and pushing in that wheel with all the energy that they're bringing, and probably the older generations have lost through time. So we're not competing. We're here doing the exact same thing. It's just that we have different roles in the whole prospect of society.
Okay. Okay. And did you add the first question, which is what's, in your opinion, the role of youth in restoring Africa's drylands?
Yes, pushing forward. That's bringing the energy and the belief and the hope and just pushing things forwards. We never allow things to stop. We're always constantly trying to evolve things. And I think our role is to push things forward.
That's true. Thank you very much, Adjany. I took one thing from you, and that is, it is not a competition. Each one of us should have a role in the society. This applies to every one of us, all stakeholders in the environment. It is not a competition. Let each one of us play our roles, and together we can make the world a better place. Thank you very much, Adjany, for your insightful answers. Now we have a few questions coming in from the audience, and I would like to thank everyone for watching and interacting in the chat. Let's check out the first question. Okay, I can see one question here, and one is, what are some of the potential struggles and what are some ways to overcome them? Adjany, this question is for you.
Potential struggles.
What are some struggles and what are some of the ways to overcome them when it comes to ecosystem restoration?
I think the potential struggles are, what is the word in English? Some people avoid change. Some people are very reluctant to change. Change itself, it's very scary. I think that is one of the things that hinders restoration more, because it has to be a collective effort. It has to be every single one engaged in doing our potential best towards it. And some people have the idea, other people will do it for me. I don't have to do anything. So I think change is one of the biggest challenge and struggle that we have to almost force into some societies and some places. And a way to overcome them is to show that change is actually the best thing for ourselves as a species, as a social complex society, and showing them the final benefits that it will have directly into our lives, so we can overcome this challenge. Because sometimes people can only understand the importance of something when it is directly applied to their own life. It's a little bit selfish, but it is how it is. So I think looking at that is a way to overcome this challenge.
Great response. Collective efforts, and one of the struggles are change. We only have to embrace change. Another question from the audience says, do the traditions sometimes are a problem? How to bring new practices when traditional habits are bad? Okay, I'll take the question again. Usually, traditions are sometimes a problem. How do we bring in new practices when traditional habits are bad?
One reason why most projects are not community inclusive, it's because it's very time consuming and there takes a lot of effort, because there's a lot of conversations happening. And as I mentioned, there's no such thing as an ideal conversation. It's always a midpoint, a compromise that both the communities and yourself have to do. So the first thing is to have them understand the shift in the dynamics that makes this tradition now, currently, in the current moment, bad. Because for millennia, it wasn't bad. So why is it now bad? So you have to take that step, and really is a learning and teaching moment where you have to make them see that in the current situation of the world and the modern human society, that the tradition has shifted now to a non-sustainable one. And once they understand that, they might be able to help you understand how it can improve for themselves. So having them make the decision so you don't force it into them. So I think that step is sometimes forgotten, that you have to remind them, you have to show them why is it bad? Why do you think it's bad? Not just assessing, just deciding it's bad and then just leaving them out of the blue. You have to explain them and hear their reasoning behind the practice itself.
Yes, that's true. Well said. Systems have changed, and we have to create the awareness that this unsustainable way of living, we were living sustainable before. That's well said, Adjany. Another question from the audience is, what is the advice you would give to a young person starting now with your first steps in a career within the environmental sector? Very good question, especially for myself.
It's a difficult career to follow through because it's a very gray world. You keep hearing about bad news. We're losing this species and that landscape is now dying, and everything is dying. Sometimes you lose hope and you kind of get desperate, like, what am I doing with my life? I think the most important thing, and it sounds very philosophical, but the most important thing is keep focus and keep believing. We've started this because we believed in something, and we shouldn't let all of the bad news and all of people trying to discourage us to stop us from believing, from hoping, from thinking that we do have a role and we do have a part in all of this. I think believing and hope is the biggest advice that I can give, because there will be certain obstacles and there will be some people that will purposely put those obstacles, and you have to look at the obstacle and say, I believe that after this obstacle, I will reach the goal that I've always believed. And just keep that in mind whenever your energy is running low and whenever anyone says that it's not possible. It is possible. It's possible. You've seen it all. You have a vision. Just go for it. The only person that can stop you is literally yourself.
Yeah, that's true. As youth, I think we have to highlight this as your quote. As youth, keep believing and keep focused. Keep believing and keep focused. Okay, we're going to take a last question from the session, and it says, yesterday, the first ever digital conference focused entirely on Africa's dryland and how integrative restoration practices can see them flourish once again. As an Angolan and an ethno-conservationist, what is something the world should know about Africa's dryland?
I've heard some people throughout the world look at Africa's dryland as something bad, as something almost dead. We do have certain patches of the continent that are extremely dry. We're talking about the Sahara Desert, we're talking about the Kalahari Desert, deserts in general, for example. And people keep thinking that, why should we waste our time trying to protect and conserve areas that are supposedly dead? Well, not really. Every ecosystem has their own dynamics and their own importance. And actually, some drylands are extremely important, not just for the survival of biodiversity and for biodiversity in general, but also, and it always comes to the humanity, right? But also for us, the importance that drylands has for our survival, for our culture, for just the way that we interact with nature itself. So I think the world should know that Africa's drylands are not a dead end. They're not a point where you just stop. There's no point in restoring something that is dead. It is something worth fighting for. It is something worth protecting. It is something worth investing, because it is the source of life beyond humanity.
Great, 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 great. It is something worth fighting for. It is worth something investing. Africa's dryland. And I'll take one last question before we bring the session to an end. What is your favorite aspect of working in conservation projects that are community led?
Oh, the learn and the engagement. Engaging with communities is perhaps my most favorite activity in the world. Learning with the elders, playing with the children, just understanding where they are and how it fits in the modern concept. I have a lot of fun with that. Just learning, I think it's my favorite aspect of working with them.
Okay, and did you face any sort of challenges, or what are some personal challenges you faced actually working with them?
I think initially is the acceptance. It takes a while for the communities to trust you, to open up, to teach you. It takes a while for them to be convinced that you're there for them, that you are not there for whatever economic purposes that most people engage with communities for. I think that is a challenge that is overcome with time, but it's also very sensitive because if you lose the trust of the community, then that's it. That's it. You're not regaining it. So it's something that I take very carefully, but also very seriously. But I don't let it affect my relationship with them because it's very open and it's very dynamic. It's very fluid.
Okay, and maybe one last question before I leave you. You see that the theme for the youth session is decolonizing restoration. I would like to ask, what does this actually mean to you, especially decolonizing restoration in Africa?
That is a very interesting question. What does it mean to colonize restoration in Africa? We tend to do copy and paste, or we tend to have models that are written and designed in the Western world to be applied in Africa. As I mentioned
Hmm.
before, there is no such thing as a one size fits all solution. What has worked in the US, what has worked in Europe, might not be, and most definitely will not be something that will work in Africa because our social dynamics are completely worlds apart. Our economic reality is very different, and just the challenges that we face nowadays is very different. So, when you have a plan that is forged elsewhere with a very different cultural, economic, social background, um, it is very difficult to apply. And throughout most of the history of conservation, it was forced into us. This is what conservation looks like elsewhere, and this is what you have to do to achieve it. And that's why communities were always put to the side because they have a very different perspective of that. And I think decolonizing conservation is a bit of that, is kind of looking at those guidelines and protocols and say, great, it's a great idea. However, I need to adapt it into my own reality. And you can only do that if you have grown into that reality. So mostly if you're African or if you have lived your entire life in Africa, you actually understand the dynamics. So I think
Yeah.
decolonizing restoration and conservation is that, is an African looking at conservation beyond what it looks like elsewhere in the world, and just understanding that our continent is very unique, as every continent is unique, and that we
Mm.
need to take charge and empower ourselves to be able to question what is being told to us and
Okay.
question what we are being forced to apply.
Mm. Great, great, great to hear. We should move away from the copy and paste approach, and we should know that not all models are the same at all geographical areas. Great. Thank you, Adjany, for being here with us today. We've learned so much from you. But before closing, I would like to hear from you in short. If you had one wish, what would you wish to see happening in the next decade in the landscape of Africa? Briefly.
Oh goodness, you left the most difficult question for the end. What would I wish to see happening in landscapes?
Yes.
I think unity in conservation for the sake of landscapes. We have so many landscapes that it's very difficult to look into that. But I think unity, and when I say unity, we're talking about all levels: policy making, social society, civil society, local communities, private stakeholders. I think we need to unite ourselves for in the next decade we can achieve stable conservation and restoration of our own landscapes and be proud of it.
Okay, great. Unity, awesome. Thank you once again, Adjany, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did and we all did. Tune back in this afternoon at 1:30 EAT to learn about more on agroforestry and how can that be an opportunity for youth in Africa. We would want to leave you with this quote from Wangari Maathai. It says, "You cannot protect the environment unless you empower people, inform them, and help them understand that these resources are their own and they must protect them." And lastly, from Adjany Costa, very intriguing, she says, "As youth, keep focused, keep believing, and be united." Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you in the next sessions. Thank you.